Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good Tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights, LLC, and is in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Shalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Khan Olav Shalom, and Rabbi Yael HaKohen Khan Olav Shalom. It's also in schus and merit of Rabbi Zev Yecheskel and Rasha Katz, Le'erech Yomim V'Shanim Tevis, for many long, healthy years. So we finished chapter 10, Perek Yud, and now we go into Perek Yud Aleph, chapter 11 of Tanya. So as we may recall, from the beginning of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe immediately established, based on the Gemara, the 5 categories: Tzadik v'Tevlei, Tzadik v'Ralei, a Rasha v'Tevlei, and a Rasha v'Ralei, and a Beinani. That's the Gemara. The Alter Rebbe's Chiddush is that it's not just based on their actions, it's based on their personality. And in Perek Yud, indeed, he finally went back to explain what a tzaddik is. Both levels, the tzaddik v'tevle and the tzaddik v'rale, also known as tzaddik gomer and tzaddik she'eino gomer. That it's more than just an action. It's not just a tzaddik who only does mitzvahs and doesn't do, God forbid, any averos, any sins. But his personality, meaning in his inner drive, is completely divine by a tzaddik gomer. There's not room for anything else, for the possibility of anything but God. A tzaddik she'eino gomer, a tzaddik v'raloi, as he explained, doesn't have any ra, and definitely doesn't have any averos, but it's not absolute, total, consumed with love to God, so therefore there's some trace, something remains that has not completely been transformed. And that's why v'raloi, that ra, that negative, is kafur for batel, it's completely subjugated and nullified to the good that's within him. Now in chapter Yud Aleph, Perek Yud Aleph, chapter 11, he goes now to the Rasha. The Rasha also has 2 levels: Rasha v'Tevle and Rasha v'Rale. And here too he's going to explain how it's a personality. It's again not just a Rasha, someone who does a sin. He's capable of doing a sin. Why? Because he's not completely consumed by the divine. And why is that? Because that's how God created the world, where the elikus, godliness, is concealed. The tzaddik has overcome that concealment. The question is, to what extent? The Rasha has not overcome that concealment, and that's why he's a Rasha. But in the Rasha itself, there's also Rasha v'Tevle and Rasha v'Rale. So that's critical to keep in mind. The Alter Rebbe used the Lashon in the beginning of Tanya, in chapter 1, when he said that Amiti Shem HaToyar, the true meaning of Rasha and the true meaning of Tzaddik is more than just their behavior and their actions, as we learned back in chapter 1. Now, just to give the context, after those questions that he asked in chapter 1, the Alter Rebbe began with the 2 nefashos, that every Jew has 2 souls, beginning with the animal soul, the end of chapter 1, the divine soul, which is is focused on in chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5, which is first chelik elikam mal mamish, the nefesh hashenis is the divine soul, the faculties of the divine soul, the garments of the divine soul, and then in chapter 6, 7, and 8, he spoke about the nefesh habamis, the animal soul. Again, its very personality, its faculties, and its garments, its expression through thought, speech, and action. And then in chapter 9, he came back and said, now that we all know these 2 souls, they're pitted against each other. There's a battle going on. 2 kings over one small city, the person and his faculties. And after explaining that battle and all the levels to the point where one conquers the city, but there too there's many levels. You can conquer the city, but there still remains some resistance, or at least those that have not been transformed to be allies of the king. Then he goes and says, and now that we've established this battle, how is it measured? So a tzaddik is the first. A tzaddik, the nefesh elikis, is completely dominated. In that itself, there are levels. Now, in chapter 11, he goes now the other side, where the Nefesh HaBamis is dominated. Because remember, the two kings are fighting over a small city. Irk the person, and all his faculties. So in the chapter Yud, Perek Yud, he speaks about the tzaddik, which is fitting to the chapter itself. The number of the chapter is 10, which is a complete number. The tzaddik, and that attack of the divine soul, that king dominates. Not just dominates, completely conquers, and even transforms entirely by tzaddik gomer, and not entirely by tzaddik sheina gomer or tzaddik virale. Now in chapter 11 comes the other side. And 11 is also a number that is associated with klippus, as it says in the Chassidus. 10 is the complete number of Gedusha. 11 is already the makif of Levena, which is associated with the negative, which perhaps hints to the fact that the chapter is about the Rasha. The Rebbe says this in the Sikha in Tov Shemem Gimel. So bottom line is, now we're going the other side. The other side, what happens when the other king wins? Or at least is winning? That's the story of the Rasha. And as we'll learn here, Rasha, when we use the word Rasha, we use it flippantly. This person's a Rasha, a wicked person. Remember, a Rasha could be someone who just did one Aveda. But more importantly, a Rasha is a state of being. Like we said, a personality type. And we'll learn that we're all in that category. We definitely begin in that category. Not because we deliberately are that way, because we're born into a world where the animal soul is very powerful. And the divine soul is concealed. You need work to change that. Which of course is going to be the work that ultimately the Beinoni is we'll learn in chapter 12, the next chapter, that the Beinoni comes and doesn't allow the animal soul to dominate, at least not in thought, speech, and action. But we'll get to that. Right now we're going to define the Rasha. Now you may remember a concept before we learn inside, based on the pasuk in Kehelah, Zel umazeh osa lekim. So we learned this already back in chapter 6, when he spoke about the Nefesh Halikis, Nefesh Habamis. So he spoke about that just like the Nefesh Halikis has 10 faculties, so too the Nefesh Habamis, because Zelu Umma Ze Osa Lekim, which means God created everything like a mirror image. One thing opposite the other. So now he's going to use this concept to explain also Tzaddik and Rasha. And it's fascinating if you think about it. Because what we have here is all ends of the spectrum. The tzaddik spectrum, the tzaddik's end of the spectrum is where the divine is completely dominant. To the highest point would be the tzaddik gomer, where there's no room, like we spoke about, Erein Sof Lifnei Atzimtzum. Eid Milvade. Person who's completely consumed with the emes sheba emes, godliness itself, which makes total sense. But remember, God created that tzimtzum. He concealed that. And that's why, hence, there are other levels. The Rasha is the other extreme, where what dominates is this world, the material world. And to what extent, we're going to learn that there are many levels. And that's the Zelu Mazeh. So let's learn inside, and we're going to learn also the two levels, Tzaddik, just like a Tzaddik B'Tevlei, Tzaddik V'Rale, is a Rasha B'Tevlei, a Rasha V'Rale. Most of the chapter is dedicated to Rasha B'Tevlei, and we'll see why, because that's the most common. And the end of the chapter is going to speak about the other extreme. So if a tzaddik v'tevlei is here, you're going to have a Rasha v'rale all the way here. Then there's a tzaddik v'rale that's basically closer to that, a tzaddik v'rale, and corresponding to that is a Rasha v'tevlei. So the highest level of the tzaddik corresponds to the lowest level of the Rasha. The next level of the tzaddik v'tevlei, the tzaddik v'rale, corresponds to the Rasha v'tevlei, as we'll learn inside. But we're going to have now the description is really, when you start reading it, you'll see yourself in the mirror. Because this is going to describe what it means to live in a material world where materialism and the needs of the body and of the animal soul are very powerful. This doesn't mean the Nefesh Halikis is not there. And many times it's very active. But we're going to see here that natural state. A tzaddik is not so natural, to most of us at least, or to even all of us. Because you're talking about someone who completely has eliminated an animal soul. Remember, the animal soul is a God-created entity. We learned even earlier that has l'shem shamayim. Its intention is to tempt and challenge the person to bring out their deeper koiches. But it's the tzaddik that actually wins that battle. The question is, to what extent? Now we're going to be talking about the Rasha, which does not win that battle. And what dominates is materialism. You wake up in the morning, what do you feel? You feel your physical entity, physical being, your physical entity, your physical needs. Then the question is, how much work are you going to do to sublimate that, to subdue it, to restrain, and ultimately listen to your divine soul. So let's learn inside, and then we'll apply it to our situation. Perek Yud Aleph. Perek Yud Aleph. V'zelu umazeh. As we spoke, one opposite the other, zeh, is opposite the other. We said God created everything one opposite the other, as we learned back in chapter 6, where he quoted that Kehelis, which is Kehelis Zayin Yudalad, 7:14. That, so therefore, Rasha v'tevlei lu'umas tzadik v'raleh. So literally, the Rasha v'tevlei, the Rasha that has it good, or as we'll learn, the Rasha who's good, is subjugated to the Rasha part of him, which also has the words Ra in it, Rasha, Reish, Shin, Ayin. That's the Lu'umas, the corresponding, you can say, the conceptual opposite, the mirror image on the other side of the spectrum of what? Of Tzaddik V'Raleh, of the Tzaddik V'Raleh who has it bad, which means his negative is subjugated to his positive, as we learned in chapter 10. So there you have the Lu'umas. Why is it so important to emphasize that? Because it helps us understand personality. It's like when you see two people, let's say Yaakov and Esav, twins, or in general, two people who have very different personalities. They have diametrically opposite personality. Yaakov is Ish Tom Yoshev Ahalim. He's the innocent man, the wholesome man, dwells in the tent, studies Torah. Esav, Yedid Tzayid Ish Melchama. He's shrewd, he's a warrior. Very different. So when you really want to appreciate one, you could analyze that, but it also helps when you contrast it with the other. So the fact that we're contrasting the Rasha v'Tevlei to the Tzaddik v'Raleh is going to help us understand both of them, actually. Because everything by contrast, it makes it clear. If you look at, let's say, a color white, you could appreciate it, but when you put it right side by side to the color black, you really appreciate it because you see contrast. The same thing, a perfect circle. You juxtapose an imperfect circle, and then you could see by the contrast one from the other. So contrasting actually helps clarity in understanding something. You say someone's a good person, someone's not such a good person. So you can't always know if you only look at one. When you look at both side by side, then you see the contrast. And that's what he's going to explain here. So it's not just a contrast, a physical contrast, obviously. We're talking here about a psychological, an emotional, spiritual contrast. But let's first define what the Rasha v'Tevlei is. So that's where he begins with Rasha v'Tevlei. Is Lu'umas Tzaddik V'Raleh. Dahainu. So explains the Alter Rebbe, Dahainu, this means that Shatev Shebenafshe Elikis. Remember, everybody has a divine soul, including the Rasha. The good in his divine soul. And where is his divine soul? We learned in chapter 9. Shebemoiche ubechol hayemoni shebelibe, which dwells or is found, dwells in his brain, in his mind, and the right chamber of his heart. Why is the Alter Rebbe bringing that? He said it already in chapter 9. Because he wants to show how everybody has it. So the Rasha has a mind. The Rasha has a right side of his heart. He doesn't only have a left side of his heart, where the animal soul dwells. He has a mind, and he's capable of using the mind, as we're going to be learning extensively later in Tanya. So he has a mind where the Nefesh Elikis dwells. So the good in this divine soul that dwells in his mind and in the right chamber of his heart, kofel for bottle. That's what it means. Rasha, v'toiv loy, that the toiv, the goodness, which is the divine inclinations and aspirations and longings of the divine soul to transcendent divinity and godliness, is kofel for bottle legabe hara ma'aklipa shebechol lasmoli. Kofuf is like subjugated or suppressed, ubotl, and nullified or voided by the evil of the klipa, of the shell, shebechol lasmoli, in the left chamber of the heart. Because the left chamber of the heart is where the animal soul dwells. The animal soul is like a fruit within a container, within a shell, so that you don't see necessarily the divine element in it. What you see is the outer shell, the material part. Like we learned earlier about klippas in chapters 6 and 7. That's what a klippa is. So that's with the animal soul. The animal soul is focusing on its own needs. That's what it was created for. Even though its deeper intention is to tempt, as we learned before in the end of chapter 9, but nevertheless, in actuality, it conceals the divine. It's drawn to, as we learned at the end of chapter 1 in Tanya, to the Dal. It's based on the Dal Yosei Saraim, the 4 negative elements, whether it's arrogance, or anger, or desires, or empty, hollow behavior or talk, or atzlus and atzvus, laziness, slothfulness, depression, sadness, negatives type. So all those midas, that's the nefesh habamis. That's the clip of the left side of the heart. So when you say tzaddik, we say Rasha v'teiv lei, that the teiv that's in him is loy, is kofuf v'botl. Exactly like we said before about tzaddik v'rale. That Ra means he does not completely 100% consume with the divine, so there's something, not in actuality, conceptually, potentially, but it's completely negated and subjugated to the good in him by the tzaddik, sheina gomer. Tzaddik v'rale. So the same thing with the Rasha v'tevle, but in the other extreme. Okay. So what this means basically, think of ourselves. Even though in ein adam mas me Rasha, no person can establish themselves and say they're a Rasha. And I definitely am not going to suggest that to anyone. But think of your life. No matter how good we are people in this physical world. And we will have material desires. We're not talking about anything prohibited or forbidden even. We could be hungry. We could enjoy other things in life. That's the nature of a human being. Why? The soul, the divine soul, doesn't desire anything in the physical world. It only wants to connect to godliness. But because God sent the divine soul into the body and into the animal soul, into a world, Eilam, Elosh, Helen, Vehester, so you wake up in the morning, the first thing you feel is your own body. You're tired, you're rested, you're hungry, you're thirsty. Then you train yourself and you say, Moida ani lefarnecha. And then you wash negel vasa. But that's already a training. What comes natural is elokus, is bischatzus. It's elam is bepshitas. Existence, material existence is what is a given. Then it requires the work to overcome that tendency. That's why there's Aveda. That's what's expected of us. So what happens when a person is driven by something materialistic? This doesn't mean that you're not a good person. This doesn't mean you don't have teiv in you. Doesn't mean your divine soul is not active. Best proof is you could say Moida Ani even though you're feeling your physical body. You could say Moida Ani, which is essentially responding to your divine soul. Neshama shechzata b'nishmasi. Neshama shenasata b'taherehi. That's we're talking about the divine soul. Ata barasa, ata yitzarta, etc. So you have good in you, and you can do many good things that day. You can do a lot more good even than negative. Nevertheless, because there's a ra of the Rasha, what does that mean? That materialism has a hold on you. We're not talking about a Rasha that you're a wicked, cruel person, that you're doing evil. It means that the material world is your consciousness. Your consciousness is a materialistic one. Even if you're not a Magushim, but that's the nature of the beast, that's the nature of the human being in this world. So even though there's Toiv, and it could be a lot of Toiv, it's still dominated and subjugated or voided. What he says, kofel for bottle to the Rasha, to the Ra. And remember again, Ra Maklipa B'chol Asmoli does not mean that you're doing evil. Klippa, he said, is anything sitra achra that's not elokus. The mere fact that you could even for 1 second not think about God is already klippa. Keep that in mind. Because again, this is not a type of accusation that a person's a Rasha. Shema Teira Miti, as he's calling it in Tanya, is the state of being that we are not fully godly, which is actually not the truth, because everything about us should be godly. But that's how Hashem wanted it. That's called a tachtenim. Making a diribet tachtenim is going into a world where godliness is not revealed. A Helen v'hester, mole klippers v'sitra achra, chesha kofle mechupel, a double and doubled darkness, as we learned earlier in chapter 6. Mole klippers v'sitra achra, filled with all the shells and husks that conceal the spark, like a shell that conceals the fruit within. To the point, as he says in chapter 36 in Tanya, that to the point that it be menagit, it could oppose godliness, to the point that it cries out, Ani v'avsied, me and nothing else, exact opposite, diametric opposite of Eined Mavade. The truth is, Eined Mavade, nothing but God. And here we're saying, Ani v'avsied, nothing but me. How's this all possible? Because that's the world God created. Can we reverse it? Absolutely, that's our work. But before we have that work, we're in the state of a Rasha v'tevle. A lot of tev, but the tev is engulfed and thus subjugated to a materialistic consciousness of existence in this world. The level of how much it is, we're going to learn after, is going to continue to explain. So let's continue reading. And just as so now we have the L'umazeh of Tzadik V'raloi, L'umazeh, corresponding to that is the Rasha v'tevle, as we just explained what means v'tevle. Now remember in last chapter 10, he said something else about the tzaddik v'rale, that it divides into many thousands, tens of thousands of levels. So he says this too applies to the Rasha v'tevle. And this status, this state of a Rasha v'tevle, this too, like we spoke about the incomplete tzaddik, or the tzaddik v'ralei, we said it was divided into this. So this too is subdivided into many tens of thousands of different levels. And here he has the word, be'inyan kamus ve'echus, habitl v'kfifas hatev l'ra. What distinguishes between the levels? So similar to what he said by the tzaddik, which we'll go over in a moment, that it depends on the extent to which the good is suppressed or subjugated, bitla and kfifa. There earlier he said kofuf for bottle. Kofuf literally means when something is bent over or subjugated. Bottle means it's nullified or voided in the presence of what it's subjugated to. So here he uses the opposite order. That is a bitl. That it is bitl v'kfifas hatev. That is voided or nullified and subjugated by the evil quantitatively and qualitatively. So quantitative means chaz v'shalom, God forbid. Because obviously this is God forbid, but that's the situation. So kamus would mean simply in number, in volume. In volume it means when a person, let's say just how many mitzvahs you do a day, and how many, God forbid, sins. It could also mean how much of your faculties are being used. If you're using your mind, your emotions, your behavioral, your actions, or only part of that. How much time you spend doing something good and something negative. Like we're going to learn the different intervals. That's kamus. Eichus habitl is like in anything, in qualitative, is how qualitatively is one dominant. You could have them compartmentalized, which means you're doing good in one compartment and doing bad in another compartment. Bad meaning, again, materialistic. Or the quality of your goodness is much weaker than the quality of your materialistic inclinations. And this is what determines the tens of thousands of levels he describes. She literally can diagnose and assess a human being based on this. So when you say, let's say we're all live in this materialistic world, but not everybody is affected by it equally. Some people will say they're very submerged in certain taivas, in certain desires. And again, let's focus on material desires, not forbidden ones. Others are very refined. Even in the materialistic side, they're very refined and very edel, very subtle type of immersion. But they're still there. And then the other way around. The good that they do, some of it is always a good that has some type of ulterior motive. Some people's good is very, very pure. I'm just giving one example. There are many examples that really, when you go through it, and especially you go through every aspect of a person, you'll find some people in certain areas, they're extremely charitable and kind and giving. But in other areas, they're very crass. And you go through and analyzing and diagnosing a person, you can go through this kamus and echus of the balance that and the counterbalance between our materialistic drives, our animalistic ones, the animal soul's drives, and our divine soul's drives, and that's where you come up with the very many different levels that he describes. Now, why is this so vital? Because we're trying to understand ourselves. And now you see also the value of the contrast. Even though a tzaddik v'rale, definitely a tzaddik v'tevle, but even a tzaddik v'rale is not in our potential, as we'll learn later in Tanya. But by understanding that tzaddik's completely absorbed with godliness, and even when there's something that's not completely, it's as if it doesn't exist. Now you understand. So by contrast, we have also the opposite. The goodness in the Rasha v'tevle is nullified, or still part of and subjugated to the materialistic drives of the animal soul. The distinction is this: by the tzaddik v'ralei, there's no any semblance of anything negative. And he actually imagines, as we discussed there in chapter 10, that's completely good. Here, you can have very tangible good. There's not a good that's concealed. The good of the divine soul is there. But generally speaking, the state of being that we are, we're still material creatures. And our spiritual and transcendent drives are secondary to our materialism. That's the thing that we have to keep in mind. The next section, Alter Rebbe is now going to talk about actual examples of levels of a Rasha v'tevle. But we'll stop here, beginning of chapter 11. And you can go to TanyaApplied.com, where you can find previous episodes, as well as pose any questions. Everyone have a good Tavach, good week, be well.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.